what we're talking about, what mindfulness is, it's actually awareness, okay? And it's cultivated by paying attention. So just to get clear about this, that doesn't sound very Buddhist, does it, so far? Or very Asian, or very mystical, or very, anything. I mean, it's just paying attention. We're only alive when we're alive. This seems kind of a no-brainer, but you could say that a lot of our lives we're walking around with a no-brainer, or just basically no brain, or the brain is on autopilot or something like that. And what mindfulness really is about is bringing it back online, so to speak, in the present moment, because that turns out to be the only moment any of us ever have. But we're so good at thinking, so incredibly good at thinking, that we can spend enormous amounts of our time and energy absorbed in the past. Have you noticed that? Like, just incredible preoccupations about who's to blame for why it's like this, or how great it was in the good old days and why can't it be that way now? So there's a tremendous attraction to the past, or a tremendous aversion, but whether it's attraction or aversion, we spend a lot of time there. Would you agree? Have you noticed that a lot of the time, if you check on what your mind is up to, it's up to memory. It's up to thinking about things that are already over to a large degree. The other favorite preoccupation of the mind is in the opposite direction, the future. And if, again, you check in every once in a while, just to, sometimes I like to say, you can call yourself up. You may have to, because we're on 24/7. We're just infinitely connected. Probably every single person has one of these in pocket. I hope there are some exceptions, but and they're called smart phones. But they're not. But they can really dumb us down, because we can be infinitely connected everywhere except here. But seriously, what are our favorite preoccupations in the future? Well, one is worrying. I don't know about in the North Country. Maybe you've gone beyond worrying, but in the rest of the world, a lot of worry about things that haven't happened yet and may never happen. In fact, Mark Twain is famous for having said, and you've probably heard this in a lot of different sort of guises, but he's famous for having said, there's been a huge amount of tragedy in my life, and some of it actually happened. But there is this sayings that, we die, he died 1,000 deaths. I mean, we drive ourselves crazy over things that are not going to be happening because we're not smart enough to actually forecast the future. So if we hope for the future to be different, the only place we have to stand is now. Mm-hmm. Because, first of all, it's the future of all the moments that have come before. So if you want to be in the future, here you are. This is actually non-trivial. It's not just, tell us something interesting. Because what it invites is a kind of shift in perception and a shift in awareness, a shift in consciousness that allows us to actually live our lives as if they really mattered in the only moment we ever have. And part of that means being embodied. Because a lot of the time, we are lost in thought. That's another thing you'll notice if you start to pay attention to your mind, is that it's all over the place. It's all over the place. You don't even have to meditate for that to happen. It's its default mode. It's default mode. You don't even have to have a smartphone. You don't even have to have email. You don't even have to have a computer. It's the default mode of the mind to be all over the place. It thinks this and it thinks that. And it likes this and it hates that. And it's like, wants to approach this, but really wants to stay away from that. And it's like wired into our biology. That's called the approach avoidance. And it's kind of, the hemispheres are actually somewhat divided in terms of left hemisphere in the frontal cortical region is more approach related. And right activation, more, and that's one of the fundamental biological, features of living systems. Move towards food, move away from danger. Perfectly natural. But how we actually modulate those impulses and those reflexes and those, kinds of unconscious urges that drive us and that cause us to be reactive a lot of the time is really an art form. It's the art, if you will, of living our lives as if they really mattered. So sometimes I said, when we begin to drop in on ourselves, we can actually reclaim this moment in this body, with this heart, with this mind, and begin to shift the default setting on how we live our lives. Begin to actually move in a direction of greater balance of mind, greater groundedness in the body, greater clarity of sight, greater, if you will, recognition of what's actually unfolding moment by moment, that's not so conditioned by whether it's we like it or not. Because the world, maybe you haven't noticed this yet, but it's not actually organized around you being the center of the universe. And that actually has representations in the brain it's turning out. That there are medial networks in the frontal cortex, and that is actually called the default mode. And it's what they think, neuroscientists think, is what's happening when you're not doing anything. Well, it turns out when you're not doing anything, you're very busy. You're very, very, very busy. And one of the ways that's described is that your mind is wandering. And now there's an entire field in neuroscience focused on mind wandering. How many of you have noticed that your mind sometimes just has a life of its own? It goes here, it goes there. It's like, loves to be entertained. It's very entertaining. So yeah, that's what's called the default mode now. And another name for it is the narrative network. So it's like we're continually constructing narratives about ourselves. I mean, after all, it's the favorite topic, right? Me. What could be more interesting than me? And so mindfulness is the awareness that arises by paying attention on purpose in the present moment. Paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally. Now, non-judgmentally, that's the kicker, because as I said, the default network is operating constantly, and the default network's got ideas and opinions about everything. It's judging constantly. So non-judgmentally doesn't mean that you won't be judging when you actually start to pay attention to what's on your mind or what's going on in your life, but that you'll notice how much you are judging, how much you want to approach this and push away that, and you'll just allow that whole thing to be there as if you just put out the welcome mat for it. Okay, I'm not going to have an opinion about my opinions. I'm going to just let it all rain down for a moment. Can you feel how radical a shift that would be in your life? To just take one moment and allow everything to be as it is instead of wishing it was one way or another? The Buddhists would call that liberation. It's a kind of freedom that no one else can give you, but that allows us to, in some sense, rotate in consciousness so that for one moment we're stepping outside of time. Because if you live in the now, well, maybe you've had this experience. Just check your watch and take a look right now. And what time is it? I'll tell you what time it is. It's now. It has to do with the fact that the society has reached a point where we're beginning to understand that the exponentially increasing levels of stress in medicine, in our professional lives, in our personal lives, at every age, really require some kind of shift that is not in the form of taking some pill to numb yourself out to it or get it together, but that actually we need to cultivate what's often spoken of as the domain of being in order to not be so overwhelmed by all the doing and the performing. A lot of the time in multitasking. Anybody find yourself multitasking? Confess, that when you're on the phone, you're actually sending an email to somebody else. Anybody ever do that? Raise your hands, I want to see, confession time. Okay, and we actually do it a lot. Why? Part of it is that is really because we're so stressed. We don't have enough moments in our day to get it all done, so we start to discombobulate a little bit and juggle and cut corners. And there are now wonderful studies that are showing that actually impedes or reduces or any kind of objective measure of performance. That doing two things at once detracts from the quality of either of the one. Doing 5 things at once, or being that scattered in your mind, you don't even have to be doing anything, but when you're at the mercy of this kind of mind wandering all the time and you're trying to get things done, it's very, very challenging. Very challenging. Meditate. Maybe you're waiting for something else to happen, but nothing else happens. Nothing else happens. This is it, It's like, goodbye. The sum total of this universe of between 10 and 100 trillion cells, the whole body now we're talking about, is good enough to have gotten you here today. Good enough for now. And the more energy you pour into it, the more that robustness, whatever it is, sometimes called homeostasis, but it's a very dynamical process that we call health, as opposed to disease or disease. When we start to pour attention, energy in the form of attention into what's already right with us, it turns out that the body has its ear to the rail, the brain has its ear to the rail, the brain is part of the rail, the heart, every aspect of our being is one integrated whole. It's not like different systems. The immune system talks to the nervous system. The nervous system talks right back. And everybody else is listening in on the conversation. And it's all cells. And if you took your liver, if we all took our livers and put them out on the stage here, that would be an interesting exercise. And then we shuffled them around, and then you were all encouraged to just pick yours up on the way out. You wouldn't know which was yours. You can look at all 100 trillion of these cells in your body, and your name isn't on any of it. The reason we have to practice mindfulness, the reason we have to cultivate it intentionally, is that we're busy cultivating the opposite all day long. Cultivating anger, cultivating jealousy, cultivating, low self-esteem, cultivating, all sorts of negativity in the emotional domain or in the thought domain. And the people who are doing the telomere research are saying that their research is showing that the real stress comes from thinking. So this is a biological and molecular biological consequence that accelerates aging and accelerates a lot of heart disease. I mean, you can't interview people who die of sudden cardiac death. But if you could, you'd find out, like, probably it was a thought that did it. The wrong thought at the wrong time, dead. I'm actually not joking. I mean, it's so serious that we need to laugh. And I want to say that about meditation, too. It may have seemed like I'm not taking this stuff seriously. This stuff is so serious that it's too serious to take too seriously. And I'm serious. So this is, if any of you were alive back then, this is the cover of Time magazine back in 1983, 4 years after I'd started the stress reduction clinic. And it's just like, I look back on that time and I say, stress? What stress? Compared to now. I mean, there was no internet, there was no email, there was no instant messaging, there were no computers except mainframes. I used to say in the early 80s that I could get more work once I had my first PC, which was like gigantic, that I could get more work done in a month than I could get more work done in a day than I used to be able to get done in a month. Well, that was in the mid-'80s. Now it's like I can get more work done in a day than I could get done in a year. That's not so good. We're always on. We're always on. Not so good. We're not computer servers, we're human beings. So here is the evidence from Liz Blackburn's lab and Alyssa Eppel, who is the mindfulness researcher in her lab, Proceedings in National Academy of Sciences, showing telomere length as a function of years of chronicity of caregiving of children. This is parents with children with severe medical and disabilities, okay? So it's like an unavoidable stress. You can't just walk out on your chest and say, I don't do stress, sorry, goodbye, children. No, you can't do that. But look at this, also in that study. This is a perceived stress scale. It's the perception of stress that makes the difference. If you are just dealing with it because it's the way it is, then you can be more transparent to the stress. Your telomeres are longer. If you take everything personally, your telomeres degrade. So if you want one take-home message from this turns out to be harder to enact than it is to say. Don't take things personally when they're not personal. Okay? Then you might ask, well, when are they not personal? That's a good question to keep asking yourself. It may be they're never personal. It may be that the you that you think you are is not the real you, that you're much bigger. And now the neuroscience is actually showing that. You want to be your narrative self? Fine. Then you're using certain regions of the brain. You want to be your direct moment-by-moment experiential self, grounded in the body? You're using lateral networks in the brain, a whole different brain profile. So you choose. One is related more to happiness. The left activation in the prefrontal cortex, if you put monks in the scanners, and I'll show you some pictures of that, they have tremendous activation in the left prefrontal cortex, in particular regions that have to do with approach and that have to do with emotional balance. Major regions of the brain change with 8 weeks of mindfulness training in MBSR, including the hippocampus, including the cerebellum, including the posterior cingulate cortex. All of these are involved in making meaning, in self-regulation, in perception, decoding, memory, and learning. Not bad for 8 weeks of what looks a lot, if you were looking in from the outside on our patients, looks a lot like nothing. They do nothing lying down. Then they do nothing sitting. Then they do nothing walking, like this, like the Night of the Living Dead, really slow meditative walking. They're doing nothing, and healthcare is paying for it. Amazing. How did they pull that off? And it turns out the brains are changing not just in terms of activity, in terms of structure. Significant thickening in those regions I mentioned, significant thinning in the amygdala, which is the emotional reactivity center, the threat center that fires off all the time whenever we feel threatened or, accosted in one way or another. How many of you see a triangle? Raise your hands if you see a triangle in this picture. Okay, now keep your hands up there. Okay, now look around so that you know you're not alone. If you see a triangle in that picture, it's interesting because there's no triangle in that picture. A triangle is defined by a three-sided figure, and what your mind does is it puts in the sides. If we shifted that little Pac-Man the tiniest little bit, so the mind can actually see things that are not there. The brain actually does that. It's so good at that. But then you don't see the gorilla. Why? Because the mind has told itself, the brain has told itself, the white shirt, so what's important? Tune out everything that's not white. Well, the brain, it turns out, is fantastic. I just showed you, it sees things that aren't there, and it doesn't see things that are there. Not very reliable. Now, does that apply to you? I'll leave that for you to decide. It's called your life. And it's all really more than magnificent. And if you can get into that implicational meaning of the poems, the poetry, then there's the potential to actually live your life as if it really mattered moment by moment. And it turns out that that's recruiting and morphing brain pathways that when you're depressed and you're into depressive rumination, it's not about shutting that stuff off, that kind of toxic thought stream, but actually learning how to hold it differently, and then you don't take it personally, and then you actually don't fall into depression. You don't relapse into depression, and I'm talking major depressive disorder. And that affects your telomeres, and that affects actually gene expression in your body, upregulating and downregulating hundreds of genes that have to do with cancer and that have to do with inflammatory responses. So if your whole body is really plastic, and the more you tune the mind and the body together, the more you participate in your own health and well-being. I like to call the medicine of the future, or the medicine of the present actually, participatory medicine.